Have you ever felt like there's more to life than you are experiencing? Do you feel like something is missing? Os Guinness has a new book called Signals of Transcendence, in which he suggests that if we would only listen, there are common signals that beep insistently throughout life, pointing to deeper meaning in the universe. What are these signals? How do we recognize them? And what do they mean? Os, it's great to have you back. I've been looking forward to jumping into your new book. Thanks for coming on.
What a pleasure to be with you again, Sean. Thank you.
Well, I'm intrigued by what you mean by a signal of transcendence, but instead of a definition, let's start with a story and then kind of unpack what you think this means. So, if you don't mind, one of the first stories in the book is about Malcolm Muggeridge. Maybe if there's some viewers who aren't familiar with that name, who was he and what kind of experience did he have that woke him up to the possibility of the divine?
Well, Muggeridge was one of the great journalists of the 20th century, but he was well known for debunking things that he thought were all hollow.
Hmm.
So, for example, his years at Cambridge disillusioned him for education totally.
Hmm.
And then he went to the Soviet Union, and he was the first Western journalist to see through all the bunk that Stalin was saying, when so many people from the New York Times and H.G. Wells and many, many others were believing Stalin. And Muggeridge saw through it. He came back very disillusioned from that and then went to India, thinking that religion, Hinduism maybe, could give him the answers. But all his experience in India decided that religion had no more answers than politics and education. And when World War II broke out, he was sent to the intelligence service to East Africa, monitoring German shipping. And nothing could have been more boring and inconsequential, he thought. And it sort of summarized for him the complete pointlessness of life. And as he was brooding on this with stale cigar smoking and stale alcohol, he thought there's one contribution I can make to the war. I can kill one person, myself.
Wow.
So he decided to commit suicide. Now, he didn't want his family to be embarrassed or ashamed, so he thought he could drown. That would be easier than barbiturates or whatever. So he undressed on the beach and swam out into the dark, warm ocean. But as he was intent on taking his own life, he suddenly looked back. And after a lifetime of feeling totally homeless in the universe, he suddenly saw the lights in the little cafe back on the shore, and they struck him like home. And he said it was like a gleam of light coming into Plato's cave for the prisoners. And he turned around and went back. There was somehow home in this disordered universe. And he had to search for where that home might be.
Hmm.
And for him, it was a signal of transcendence, unusual one. But Muggeridge, many of his biographers said the same thing. He knew what he disbelieved before he knew what he believed. So, against all this disillusionment with education and with politics and with religion, suddenly he glimpsed there must be home and order and meaning in the universe.
Now let's pull out what you mean by a signal of transcendence. So give us a definition now that we have an example from Muggeridge.
Well, the term comes from my mentor and friend, sadly, the late Peter Berger, who in a book in the 1960s called The Rumor of Angel has a passage on signals of transcendence. And by that he means, and I mean, people have experiences very deep and profound to them, which do two things. First, they puncture whatever they believe. Not enough, not satisfying. There must be something more. But also, positively, they point. They point beyond. There's no proof there. They point to something which, if true, would make all the difference. So that puncturing the contradiction and that pointing to, setting off in their hearts and their minds a desire. That's the double sense that signals of transcendence have. Now, it was decades later for Muggeridge before he found an
Hmm.
answer. But what the signals do is constitute a seeker or a searcher. And you know, Sean, Plato's Socrates' famous saying, the unexamined life
Hmm.
is not worth living. Now, the fact is, many, if not most people, are living lives not worth living because they've not
Hmm.
thought about it, they've not cared about it. But a signal breaks in and beep, 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 punctures what they believe to this point and points to something which they know they need to find out if it's true or not.
So, how would you maybe compare and contrast this with, say, Paul's Damascus Road experience, which was a conversion? It was dramatic. It was unmistakable. He saw a light, heard something. How does that compare and contrast stories like that with what you mean by signals of transcendence?
Well, that's far more dramatic. And you
Hmm.
move from one position to another position in seconds. And that's why it's called an about turn, or the religious word conversion. What Thomas Kuhn calls the ultimate paradigm shift. And his notion of paradigm shifts in science comes from the idea of religious conversion, that dramatic about turn. Now, signals of transcendence are not that. They're beeping, beeping, beeping pointers that people have to follow. And some people, it's decades until they find an
Hmm.
answer. Some people follow for a while and then brush it off. They're not interested. But it's the signal that gets them going. And that's what constitutes a seeker. So it's not dramatic like Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus.
So, one more question, then I want to move to a second one about your mentor, Peter Berger. Is it fair to say, like with the example of Paul, it's a clear supernatural invention where these signals of transcendence are all around us all the time? The shift is less in something external that changes, but an internal shift and awareness to these certain signs that have always been there. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And of course, unlike Paul's conversion, where he moves from one position to another in 5 seconds, with a signal, it's not sure. In other words, it
Hmm.
points to something, but what could that something be? Now, as you know well, there are various possibilities, and we've discussed on other programs the fact there are broadly three families of faiths that people can
Mm-hmm.
explore. You can look at the Eastern family, Hinduism, Buddhism, or the secularist family, atheism, agnosticism, materialism, and so on, and then the Jewish and Christian understanding, all quite different. And of course, the question is for someone who has that signal, that pointer, which of these great answers gives the most adequate and, of course, eventually the true answer to why the signal is so meaningful?
Let's shift to the second one, who you said was a mentor, dear friend of yours, Peter Berger, and he refers to a mother's reassurance in the night as an act of kind of a signal of transcendence. I had never heard that kind of example before, so share that one with us, if you will.
Well, I never had either until I read Peter Berger. It's in his little book, A Rumor of Angels, and it's the chapter called Starting with Man. And he gives a whole number, a whole series of signals. The first one, the one you mentioned, nothing is more prototypical than a mother picking up a crying child at night and saying in so many words, it's okay. Everything's going to be all right. Now, that's natural, instinctive, wonderful. And millions of babies are comforted like that probably every night for all sorts of reasons. But Berger says, stop. Just think about that for a moment. Everything's going to be all right. Wait a minute, you're born into a world in which there's risk and danger all around you. You might go to school with school
Hmm.
shootings. We have threats of nuclear. And at the end of it all of us, without exception, are going to die. Not just the child, but the mother. Everything is not all right in much of the world. So, how can a mother say something like that? And what does it actually mean? It implies an order, a good something or someone behind the universe, which may or may not be true. And the question is it true? And people pondering that set out on that thinking experiment to try and find the answer to that.
Now, you have a page where you list some other terms that refer to signals of transcendence. What are some other common things that these are often referred to as, or maybe known as?
Well, you've got the full list there. I can't remember, but things like triggers, hints,
Mm,
intuitions, intimations,
mm,
epiphanies, glimpses. There are all sorts of words have been used by different people, but all of them grasping for something they know is
mm.
happening. They've had this profound experience. Life is prompting it. They don't maybe even believe in God. So we can't say it's the divine, but something is prompting them. So they set out to search for the meaning of it.
I like the word you use, hints here, or metaphysical hunger pains in the list. I sent out a tweet maybe a few weeks ago, and I said to my atheist and agnostic friends, is there anything about the world that maybe suggests there's a God or hints at a creator or gives you pause? And it was interesting. Quite a few said nothing. I've made up my mind. Some said fine tuning, some said beauty, and pointed to other things. Seems like these are the kinds of hints that you're saying, that there's certain features in the universe that just suggest there's more to life than what we can see and touch and feel. So why is it that we're not more aware of these kind of hints around us today?
I think for all sorts of reasons, Sean. I mean, you just take a simple fact, which is true in any generation. Children ask questions.
Hmm.
They're filled with wonder and curiosity. Daddy, why this? Mummy, why that? Question after question after question. Some of the adults answer, some of them we haven't time to answer, some of them we haven't a clue how to answer. But the trouble is, as we get to adults, in the serious adult world, we lose that sense of wonder and curiosity,
Hmm.
and we ask ourselves far fewer questions. Now, that's really tragic.
Hmm.
But you could say, too, a feature of our modern world are cities, urbanization.
Hmm.
And of course, most people living in cities as opposed to the country, they're living in a man made, purely artificial world. So there's very little of nature or creation or the animal world to raise a sense of wonder or curiosity in us, but it still happens. So there are all sorts of reasons. Now, Blaise Pascal, a great French mathematician and scientist, his word for why people don't think like this was diversion.
Hmm.
Because we live in a world in which we're all going to die. Or as T.S. Eliot said, we can't bear too much reality as humans. And the final reality, we're going to die. So, Pascal says, we surround ourselves with diversions, busy, entertaining distractions. Now, in his day, that was the privilege of the elite and so on, with all their gambling and so on. You think of our world, the so called screenagers,
Hmm.
teenagers totally dependent on triple screen gazing and the mobile phone in their hand. I mean, what a diversion.
Hmm.
How few of them even relate to each other as friends face to face, let alone think about the meaning of life. So, a major reason all around us, Sean, is diversion in
Hmm.
this highly sophisticated technological modern world.
You're right that that's a term for teenagers, and I think you would also agree that it's not just teens who are distracting themselves on technology, but now it's transcending generations. We don't have to feel lonely, don't have to feel bored. We can always fill every moment with something. You're suggesting maybe missing some of these signals that point to something beyond the world in front of us. So let's move to the third one. You talk about two experiences that W.H. Auden had that he would consider signals of transcendence. Tell us about those, if you will.
Well, the second was the one that is my favorite in the whole book.
Hmm.
W.H. Auden graduated from Oxford, brilliant as a poet, hailed as one of the great poets of his time, atheist, left wing. He fought on the Republican side against Franco in the Civil War in Spain, and notoriously a gay at a time where it was not
Hmm.
popular and fashionable to be a gay as it is today. So Auden came over to America to escape the looming war clouds in Europe. But of course, he wanted to follow things, and no television in those days. This is 1939. So he would go every Saturday evening to the local cinema to see the documentary Pathé News. And unbeknownst to him one night, he went to the cinema in Yorkville, in the Upper East Side of New York, and he didn't realize most of the audience there were German. Now, if you think 1939, Britain was fighting Germany and Germany, Britain, but America neutral. So you had the Brits in America supporting Britain and the Germans supporting Germany, and most Americans wanted to keep out of it. But the documentary was on the siege of Poland and Nazi stormtroopers bayoneting women and children
Hmm.
brutally. And the German audience in the whole film cried out, kill them, go on, egging on their own side. Auden was horrified. First, he said, for the first time in his life, he knew that in humanity, including his own heart, was evil. He'd always thought we were good. Better psychology or education or politics, all would be. No, we were evil. But then he said he was caught. He'd never believed in anything absolute. That was for old fogies. But he had to say Hitler was absolutely wrong. Not,
Hmm.
not culturally because he was not English or not American, he was German. No, absolutely wrong. And Auden said, I left the cinema, a seeker after an unconditional absolute, and met Jesus. He wanted the grounding for what he now knew had to be something absolutely true, absolutely just and right
Hmm.
in the universe. And that was what set him off in his search. And not too long afterwards, he came to faith.
So oftentimes evil is what turns people away from faith. It seems to him it helped him reflect inside and cry out for a standard of justice and ultimately pointed him towards God, didn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's
Hmm.
actually true of many people today. I mean, you probably know the original meaning of woke came from the 1930s and the blues singer, Leadbelly, who used the word stay woke, but what he meant was stay alert to injustice.
Mm.
That original meaning, that's terrific. Everyone should be alert to injustice and outraged by what is wrong. But as Auden realized, you need an absolute to know what is wrong in the light of what's right, what's false and a lie in the light of what's true, and what's absolutely wrong in the light of what's absolutely good. Now, where does that come from?
Hmm. That's exactly the right question. The same question that C.S. Lewis asked as well in his journey, and was one what you might call signal of transcendence that ultimately brought him to faith. Let's go to the fourth signal that I think is really interesting, which is different and in some ways the opposite. It's the heart cracking goodness that motivated Philip Halley beyond despair and pointed towards hope. So, who was Philip Halley, and what is this heart cracking goodness that was a signal of transcendence?
You're right. And that's the fourth story, not the fourth signal. It's the fourth signal in my
There you
fourth,
go.
but it's
Fair
not
enough.
as if I'm trying to categorize them. No,
Mm,
Philip Halley was Jewish, grew up in Chicago in a slum where he saw a lot of violence, including murder and so on. And he went from that world, drafted in World War II as a GI, and saw the horror of war and then the horror of what the Nazis did. And he became a scholar determined to investigate and do research on the horror of the German doctors, for example,
mm.
doing operations on children without any anesthetics because they were just bodies and so on. But after 25 years of this, teaching at a university, he brought himself through this dreadful study to the place of despair. And one day he left his very happy family, knowing that his wonderful, generous Italian wife could well go on without him. He went down to his study contemplating suicide.
Mm.
And as he was sitting there looking at all the books on all the horrors he'd researched, he thought, there's a shelf on resistance I've not really looked at. And he just picked out a pamphlet, started reading it. He said after a few minutes, he thought he had a fly in his eye, put up his finger. It was a tear.
Mm.
What? His heart had grown hard and cynical and despairing in the light of the evil he'd seen time after time. He was reading the story of the Huguenots in a little village in
Mm.
southwest France. And these Huguenots, who'd been persecuted themselves by the church for 300 years, had rescued 5,000 Jewish children
Wow.
at the risk of their own lives. And as he started to read the story, he said he was just stopped in his tracks by the
Hmm.
heart cracking goodness. So in this case, it wasn't evil over against goodness, it was goodness over against evil. And it stopped him from any sense of suicide and brought him back to a proper face of faith in life and in God.
Now, in a number of these stories, people are in such dramatic positions in life. Muggeridge is considering suicide or actually going out to commit suicide. The story with Philip Halley, he's at the point where he's just in despair and he's hardened and feels this tear come down and goodness broke through. Are
Mhm.
these kind of signals, do they, are there common themes about when people tend to see them? Or are they just in all different spots in life, people tend to see different signals?
No, absolutely. The second, very
Hmm.
much the second. So you take a very different one. One of my favorite writers, G.K. Chesterton.
Hmm.
I have his autograph and a photograph behind my desk on my wall. And his own signature has the stylish flourish which his writing has, which his clothes have, and so on. What a character. But G.K. Chesterton, born in the late 19th century, when he got to the stage of college, all his friends went to Oxford and Cambridge, but he was artistic. So he went to the
Hmm.
Slade School of Art in London. But it had a sort of intellectual climate very close to our postmodern climate today, cynical, debunking, nihilistic. And he said he was flirting with the occult, among other things,
Hmm.
lots of dark ideas. But as he was attracted to nihilism, he said what stopped him in his tracks was a dandelion.
Hmm.
Now, we're not talking about Nazis or anything big, huge like that. A dandelion, the beauty of a single dandelion. Now, what him was, he was well versed with the fact that the world was broken. It was ruined. Blackness and all that. You can easily see that all around. But he said, in this world of brokenness, there is beauty. He's not talking about a sunset in a Californian beach with your margarita in your hand or your girlfriend or something, or the birth of a baby. No, a dandelion.
Hmm.
The beauty of a dandelion struck him over against the darkness. So he became a seeker, a searcher. And his goal was to find a worldview that explained both, not one or the other, but both
Hmm.
the brokenness and the beauty. And if you've ever read his extraordinary book, Orthodoxy, you
Yeah.
know his description when he describes this is rather like Archimedes saying Eureka and leaping out of the bath. There's such excitement in the prose as he sees bolt after bolt after bolt, all clicking into place, because he sees that in the biblical, the Jewish and Christian view, you have a faith, a philosophy, a worldview which explains both. It's bifocal. The
Hmm.
beauty because of God's creation of a world of beauty, and the brokenness because of the inroads of sin into that world. And so the Bible, incredibly realistic and idealistic, explaining both. But it was a while before Chesterton got there, but stopped in his tracks by the dandelion, he became the seeker.
You said earlier that these aren't proofs, but just signals. Draw out that difference for us really clearly so we understand what you think these signals potentially accomplish and what they don't accomplish.
Well, that can be a little controversial today with some of our friends. I personally think that a good deal of modern persuasion follows the Greeks rather than the Jews, the Hebrews,
Hmm.
because the Greeks, with their heavy stress on reason, out of that comes things like the proofs for God, the theistic proofs, and so on. Now, people disagree over that. I come from a school of philosophy when I grew up in London University and so on, and at Oxford, which doesn't believe that those proofs work.
Hmm.
I don't think they actually work to prove God. And at the end of it, even if you're incredibly impressed with the person who's debating them, you can say, so what? In the Bible, in the Jewish and Christian understanding, I think, you don't have proofs like that. You have pointers that set people off as searchers because coming to know God in faith is a person meeting a person.
Hmm.
None of us can know each other unless I open myself to you and you open yourself to me. It's never a one-way thing, like just a proof. So the biblical way is a pointer that sets people off on a search. And if they really go through with it, then they can meet and encounter God themselves as a person, meeting the supreme person, the Lord.
Hmm.
So personally, I might think this, I can describe, as we've discussed my earlier book, The Great Quest, you can describe the
Mm-hmm.
journey of faith rationally, but it's not a proof. It's a description, a brochure as a way of a journey. People have to make the journey. So there are some books that give you an argument. So read the chapter, do you accept it or not? Put it down, do you believe it or not? No, my book's not like that.
Hmm.
The Great Quest describes a journey. People have got to go on the journey themselves, existentially, in their own existence. And here, these 10 people I describe in these stories, the signal set them off, but they had to do the searching.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, all 10 end up in the Christian faith that you use. Is that correct?
Well, except Philip Halley came back to his faith as a Jew.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So these signals, some people might see them and then go on a quest and stay as atheists or become agnostic or become Muslim or embrace other faiths. That can happen with these signals. This is just a breakthrough to suggest they're more, and then someone's got to go on the quest. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes, but
Okay.
theoretically, any
Hmm.
possible answer might answer. But actually, if you look more seriously, many of the answers fall away because the intensity and the direction of the pointer explodes some of the answers. So we haven't gone into C.S. Lewis. His was being surprised by joy, as he
Hmm.
says. Now, if you think Friedrich Nietzsche, maybe the greatest, most famous atheist of all in the last 2 centuries, Nietzsche said, joy wills eternity. But he didn't follow
Hmm.
through on that and stayed an atheist. So it's quite possible, and we'll come later, I hope, to the story of Kenneth Clark, who had an incredible signal and then brushed it off for quite a while.
Hmm.
So people don't have to follow the signal. It can beep, beep, and they say, shut up, and go on back with their lives. But the challenge is they do follow up to say which of the great answers give you the real grounding for why this signal is so important and what it means.
Well, you set me up, so I feel like we should go there. Tell us about the story of Kenneth Clark that you were hinting at.
Well, Kenneth Clark is not so well known over here in the US.
Hmm.
He's one of England's greatest art historians, and he was famous
Hmm.
for his magnificent BBC series, which you can still see, called Civilization. If ever there was a man who was patrician, erudite, suave, smooth, it was Kenneth Clark. But he had experiences, several in his case. But the main one was, as an art historian, he was studying art all over the place, especially in Florence. And one time he was in a church in Florence looking at some of the art, and he said he was so profoundly moved by the beauty, he said, quote, I felt the finger of God. And that
Hmm.
feeling stayed with him for several months. But he said, it was embarrassing.
Hmm.
If I concluded that God was there and went back to London to the art world, they'd think I'd gone off my head. Now, we know from his later story, it would have been embarrassing another way. He had a mistress at the time, and he had several. He had a mistress, and that would be rather morally embarrassing. So he shrugged it off. He felt the finger of God unmistakably for several months, but suppressed it. And most people, if you just read his two memoirs, you think that was the end of it. Clark lived and died an atheist. But actually, as the story came out at his funeral, and many of the royalty of the art world in Europe were there, and even people like Princess Margaret, a priest got up at the end and said, Lord Clark wants you to know, months before his death, he was baptized.
Hmm.
He felt the finger of God earlier, but came back to faith at the end of his life.
Hmm.
Now, a lot of people in the audience, oh, come on. We all know deathbed conversions. You can concoct these. They're all phony and so on. Then his wife got up and said, no, no,
Hmm.
this is true. Kenneth Clark came back to faith that he'd rejected early. In other words, it's never too late to listen to a signal.
Mm,
Although sadly, some people suppress the signals and
mm.
try and drown them out and never listen to them again. Now, his story I had in a reading in another curriculum I used, and a friend of mine shared it with a group of CEOs. And he said to them, any of you by any chance had experiences like this? Thinking there might be one or two out of 30 odd people. All but one had had similar experiences.
Wow.
In that group, most of them had done what Clark did earlier and suppressed it. It would have been too embarrassing, as it were, to follow through.
That's really interesting. I would not have expected that response to be so big as you mentioned. Well, let's do one more, and I got a handful of other questions for you. This one, of course, people are going to recognize is not the sixth signal, but the sixth one we're discussing related to Leo Tolstoy. Got him to reconsider his kind of thoughts on life after death. What signal did he have?
Well, Tolstoy is an extraordinary story. He published Anna Karenina and War and Peace, and he was considered the greatest novelist of his time, maybe of all time, along
Mm,
perhaps with Dostoevsky. So when he was in his early 50s, he was a count, wealthy, with thousands of acres of his estate, with
wow.
thousands of serfs serving him, 14 children, and his wife, and incredibly popular, worldwide fame. But what hit him was the knowledge he was going to die. And what on earth did life mean? And all his success and fame mean in the light of the inevitability of death? Was there any meaning that would survive it? Now, you can read his incredible search in his book, Confession.
Hmm.
It was that which struck him in from 50s, and he gave up and wrote differently and freed his serfs and did all sorts of things. To his wife, gave away a lot of his money to his wife's great chagrin and his family's chagrin and his supporters' chagrin. But it's because he came face to face with a sense of death. And you can read his story, for instance, the death of Ivan Ilyevich, and so
Mm.
on.
That's such a fascinating story and encounter of somebody as successful as he was. What message would you say these have for kind of our advanced modern age? What's the takeaway from these, so to speak?
Well, I think very, very important because I said earlier, we grow out of questioning when we're kids.
Mm,
We grow into an artificial, man made, increasingly technologically run world. But you look at our modern world. I start with that saying from Silicon Valley there must be something more. I don't know how many times people have said to me in the business world, I climbed the ladder of my success and found I was up against the wrong wall.
mm,
There must be something more. In other words, in our modern world, when people think, most of us, middle class and above, we have too much to live with, all the consumer goods, all the possible vacations and experiences and things we can have. We have too little to live for.
mm,
And that's what the signals do. Or if you put it classically, Plato said we're like prisoners in a cave with no sunlight, and the only thing they can see are the shadows on the wall cast by a fire behind them. So they see these flickering shadows in the wall, and that for them is reality. But if someone
mm,
escapes the cave and sees, wow, there's sunlight, when they come back into the cave, they'd be considered madmen. In fact, they might even be thrown out because people prefer the comfort of what they know to the risk of going outside and maybe finding it's wrong and so on. Now, Plato's cave is the good description of where we are today. In
mm,
our secular world, Peter Berger describes it, a world without windows.
mm,
If you think of most of history, you didn't mean to be a Christian, you can be a Hindu, Buddhist, pagan, animist, whatever. The unseen world was not unreal. But a key feature of our modern world, the world of modernity, what is unseen is unreal. But we're actually living in what Max Weber called the disenchanted world. And C.S. Lewis says the world that needs to be re-enchanted. And what signals of transcendence do, they break into this world. There's something bigger.
Hmm.
We are bigger than just animals or selfish genes or naked apes or tool makers. We're bigger. What is that something more? So all the signals are different, but they awaken us to the possibility, even the necessity of the something more and turn us into seekers. And I'm sure many people listening to your great podcast experience that
Hmm.
in their own lives. They know there must be something more.
Also, you talk about love being a powerful signal of transcendence, maybe even the most powerful. Why do you make that claim?
Well, again, you think of our generation. You look at Hallmark cards, which reduce love to romantic cliches, or you look at sex, reduced to the hookup culture. We have cheapened and debased so much of love.
Hmm.
But anyone who's fallen in love, and many, many have, you know what it is. And we think of the great lovers of history like Romeo and Juliet and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Something about love that defies the cheapening, that defies the debunking and the debasing of the hookup culture. There's something about love which is absolutely incredible. And I think the simplest way of putting it is that way that love wills eternity, to use the word of
Hmm.
Nietzsche again.
Hmm.
I quote the pop song. I can't remember the exact words, but if love is not forever, what's forever for? When you love someone romantically, passionately in love, this has got to go on forever. It would be a
Hmm.
sin for it to stop, and so on. Now, what gives you the grounding for that? Do the atheists, with their view of the universe as a stroke of dumb luck, Richard Dawkins, or Hinduism, where freedom is freedom from individuality, not freedom to be
Hmm.
an individual? What gives you the grounding? So, love to those who listen is a signal that prompts you and pushes you to search. But there's nothing like the fact that when you meet the Father of Jesus Christ, you meet the one who is love. And there's love in the Godhead before the universe. And there's
Hmm.
love from beginning to end in God's dealing with people. And you meet the grounding of love. And I love that because almost everyone
Hmm.
knows what it's like to fall in love truly.
Hmm. A question I've asked people sometimes is what's more powerful, death or love? If there's no God, death is more powerful than love. If there is a God, love is more powerful than death. That doesn't prove anything, but it makes us ask and wonder what kind of world we live in and what we believe about love and whether it goes on for eternity, as you suggest. Os, have you had any signals of transcendence in your own life in the past or maybe even in the present that have just jumped out to you as being more significant or memorable than others? Or is it studying this that you now look out and see them in ways you hadn't before really writing and researching this book?
No, with me, it's the latter.
Mm.
I came to faith not through a Damascus road like Paul or Saul became Paul. That's very dramatic and relatively unusual. In my case, I came to faith after 2 years of a thinking search. Having grown up in China, I knew Buddhism and Hinduism. I wasn't terribly attracted to the Eastern religions, and my search was a internal debate between atheism and the Jewish and Christian faiths. And so I
Mm.
read Nietzsche and Sartre, and my hero as a teenager was Albert Camus.
Mm.
I loved him, and I still do greatly appreciated him. And then on the other side, Pascal, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, and so on. And after 2 years of a search, I finally came to the point I was convinced that the Christian faith was true and very, very different to atheism and secularism. So mine was not through a signal of transcendence.
Mm.
The more I've thought, met people, and talked to them, it's a way so many come to faith. And I think in our
Mm.
increasingly secular age, with the world without windows effect of so many people, they're living in a shrunken reality. It's God, I call it the promptings of life.
Mm.
Looking back, you can say it's God, but at the time, you just know it must be something more. But what's behind that something more?
Well, reading your book definitely made me think about signals of transcendence in the world in the way I had not before, such as home. There's something deep and good about yearning for home and yearning for something that's permanent. And yet in this life, it's not there. Does that point to something deeper? Is a flower just a simple signal of transcendence towards God? Could even evil be so? So it's not so much a proof, but it's kind of like common grace. When you understand what common grace is, you see these acts of God's common grace making himself known to people in very subtle but powerful ways. It seemed like there was an overlap. Do you how do you anticipate this book being used? In some ways, I thought, is this meant to give to somebody that, in a sense, could be a signal of transcendence of somebody who's open to it, reading all these stories and seeing all these people that were motivated into this spiritual quest? If somebody's not there, is the goal for them just to read this book and encounter these brilliant minds and what they think and maybe act as a kind of signal of transcendence for a seeker?
Well, I hope it'll be a companion book to my earlier book, The Great Quest, which simply
Mm,
describes the journey, but arm's length. This one, I think, is more appealing because it's stories of real people. And already
mm,
it's only been out a month, but already I've had many people saying how the stories speak to them
mm,
much more deeply than any argument. So there's no argument in the book, it's simply stories.
mm,
And the challenge to people reading it, have you experienced yourself something like that? Or are you, in effect, content with sitting in the cave with just the
mm,
shadows flickering on the wall? There is more. Are you prepared to think and care and lead and examine life and ask, what could that something more lead to you? In other words, to become seekers. I hope this is a book which will prod people, prompt people, push
mm.
people to become genuine seekers. The unexamined life is not worth living. And the great thing is to challenge people to become seekers. Now, I happen also to think that in our Western world today, there'll be no renewal of Western civilization without renewal of faith. And there needs
Mm.
to be a culture wide, civilizational wide sense of awakening to something higher and deeper and richer than what so many are satisfied with today. So I hope this little book will be a little push in that direction too.
Well, I think it will. The cover is cool. It's kind of got a red feel and gold. It's got a good texture. It's the kind of book you want to pick up and just sit down and enjoy. It's about the length of a More Than a Carpenter, but of course, it's not directly evangelistic. There's nothing preachy in this book. I think you just ask questions of folks. Is there more to reality than what you see? And here's
Mhm.
some stories of people who've experienced this. What are you potentially going to do with it? And so it's a
Exactly.
very non-threatening, I think, just natural step for somebody who's maybe discontent where they're at, open to the idea that there could be a God or some meaning and wants a nudge in that direction. This is just a great place to start. So, Austin, did I miss anything? Anything else from the book you want to cover or share?
I mean, we could look at all the stories if we had more time. No, I think you covered it well. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to steal the thunder. Wanted to leave more stories in there for folks to pick up the book, but always appreciate you coming on. Signals of Transcendence is a great book. When you have books out, if you'll come back, we always want to have you on. But before folks click away, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other interviews coming up on a range of topics, worldviews, Eastern religions, Western religions, faith, culture, etc. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss any shows coming up. And if you've thought about studying apologetics, we would love to have you join us at Biola. We have the top rated fully distanced program, and we'd love to have you part. Information is below. Os, thanks so much again for joining us. Great job, and hope folks will pick up your book.
My pleasure. Thank you.